Hi, I'm Dr. Aaron Brinen, Assistant Professor of Clinical Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. This webinar was recorded when I was at Drexel University. Enjoy. Where we do a version of cognitive therapy called recovery-oriented cognitive therapy, which is really about getting people back to the lives that they want. I'll be honest, so self-injury was never sort of like the first thing that I was going after figuring out, or it wasn't something that I spent a ton of time around. My history is a history of helping individuals who have post-traumatic stress disorder. So it came up and I understood I really understood it. As we went into more and more state hospitals and started doing more work in more chronic settings, it was interesting because we were really going to help the individuals who were least likely to engage in treatment. And what we found is that people kept bringing us the cases of individuals who would self-injure. So we've really, and I've particularly spent a lot of time sort of thinking about it, looking into it. My way of thinking about something is I think about it and then I talk to everybody who I know who's an expert in it. And I think about how does this fit into the cognitive model. So that's what we're going to look at today. Some of these interventions have a little place in my heart because Dr. Beck is very interested has always been very interested in self-injury. And so whenever I would work on cases like this, he would be quite interested in it. And so he would sort of come up with interventions, and I would oftentimes use those interventions. So some of these are ones that Dr. Beck supervised me in using. So with that, let's get going. So the purpose of today's webinar, we're really going to be looking at sort of the beliefs about urges. So again, anybody who's met me or been on any of these webinars really knows that I'm not much of sort of like a mystical kind of guy. Like, I don't really like thinking of these things. I don't believe things, I think there's stuff out there we can't explain. I think if you're paying me to do a job, I should really know what's going on. So we're going to not think so much about these sort of like intangible pieces of self-injury and these ways that self-injury has taken on this sort of life of its own. And almost has its own mythology. But we're really going to talk about like what are the beliefs that go along with urges, because once we start understanding the beliefs and the behaviors people engage in, the patterns that can feel very overwhelming and sort of like out of our control start becoming really quite predictable and quite understandable. We're going to talk a little bit about chain analysis today. We did talk about that on Monday, but we're going to talk about it in the context of self-injury. And then we're going to really talk about a couple interventions that link really nicely into the CTR protocol. So we're going to talk about how do we use the protocol, and then some specific interventions. Because I'll tell you, like just getting people to be their best self is great, and they're going to feel good in the short run, but ultimately that will blow up in our face. If just going out and sort of being activated helped these individuals stop self-injuring, the Marvel movies alone should have taken care of it, much less really all the people who have been good to them and they've gone and had these good experiences. And so I think in saying just activate somebody and help them sort of find the way they are at their best, sort of demeans their experience and doesn't create a pathway forward. And so I think it's unfair to the individuals, and I think it's unfair to the providers as well. So we're going to really talk about like specific nuts and boltsy interventions that do that. So let's really think about what is self-injury, where does it come from? I think it's important to recognize that self-injury really is not suicidal behavior. Self-injury sort of, it's sort of might hang out at the same ballpark, but they're really not the same thing. So an individual's not attempting to end their life, and that's not really their intention when they're self-injuring. So it's important to know that. It can take many different forms. So obviously many people know about cutting, there's burning, individuals might swallow. There are lots of ways in which we sort of might do things to injure ourselves and really to sort of meet this sort of need that we're going to be talking about. When we're thinking about the models, this is actually a really neat quote from a colleague, Toni Morrison, in Toni Morrison's book. And it's really from Cognitive Therapy for Psychosis. And I think it really captures sort of some of the failings that we might have. These clinical models of psychopathology may appear very clever to us, but unless the models appear relevant to our patients, they will not prepare. They will not be prepared to engage in an evidence search, and this will not change their current thinking and distress level. And he means this in relation to psychosis, but I think this really applies quite well to what we're talking about right now. We can come up with the most clever of models, but if the individual if it doesn't make sense to the individual, one, it's a sign that the model probably isn't super valid. And two, it's not going to help that individual to move forward and resolve their distress, or it's not likely to. Humans have this inherent need for, or this sort of almost biological level of a need to connect with other people, right? So we yearn for connection. We've talked about this in other webinars, so much so that while individuals are likely to develop individuals are sort of biologically prepared to develop phobias to lots of things like snakes and heights and enclosed spaces. We're actually biologically prepared to fear social rejection, right? And so we yearn for this. This is such a biological drive of ours to be connected, that when it's threatened, our whole mind and our whole system can go into overdrive and can really feel threatened. And we can do many horrible things to ourselves in an attempt to feel connected. And if we feel like the connection is undone, then we even have a chance to do things to try and reclaim that. And so this cycle, and particularly when we turn around and we're going to start talking about borderline personality disorder, that sort of allergy to social rejection is going to be really important for us to sort of keep track of for the individuals that we serve. So what we're going to be thinking about is that there's sort of these two modes that individuals can be in, right? And we're going to come back to this idea of how do we activate the different modes, right? And so we think about this in the psychosis work, in that, that individuals within the adaptive mode, a lot of the symptoms sort of revert to the background. When we're talking about individuals who are likely to self-injure, right? The patient mode, it's going to be sort of high in defensiveness, high in suspiciousness toward other people. It's going to be the time when things like urges, which we're going to talk about, are going to feel really insurmountable, and there's nothing else. Everything else pales in comparison. When we're talking about the adaptive mode for these individuals that we serve, we're really going to be talking about this need for connection, that sense of sort of being with another person, the fact that I matter, the fact that I'm in there. And there's a difference between telling somebody this information and having them experience it on a really visceral level. And so we're really going to be focusing much more on how do we use the protocol to get the person in an adaptive mode where, one, they're able to connect with us and walk us through what's happening so we can understand it on a very pragmatic level. And two, so that they're able to take a step back from being sort of drowned in the experience of urges and self-injury and really look at it sort of functionally. So, and that involves sort of reducing defensiveness. So in here, we're really going after, the patient mode is rife with beliefs of others are going to reject me. I'm inherently unlovable. There's nothing good about me. And that the world is excessively dangerous and that I'm really incompetent. And so the adaptive mode will sort of inoculate against those beliefs that can be quite destructive for the individuals that we serve. So we're going to go through really quickly sort of what is recovery-oriented cognitive therapy. It's a fusion of cognitive therapy and the recovery movement. And it really is this extension of CBT for psychosis. The nice thing about it is that these traditional cognitive therapy interventions and components will be able to draw on. So it's the spirit of the recovery movement, but with the nuts and bolts know-how that cognitive therapy has always had. So I think it's the one thing people typically like about cognitive therapy. And so when we're looking at the overview of CTR, we're really thinking about this idea of activating this competing set of beliefs, network of beliefs. And it's those beliefs around being connected, valued, capable, competent, knowledgeable, right? So we're really going to activate that piece. It's the moment where the person doesn't look like they're cornered and trying to keep people away. It's the moment where they feel sort of really connected and sort of side by side, walking side by side with the provider. Once they're in that spot, actually the next move we want to do is really get those aspirations, right? Because they're going to be the driving force for treatment. You know, evaluating and figuring out why we self-injure is tough work, and it's really self-reflective, and it can be really distressing. Doing interventions to try and push against urges is even more distressing and more difficult for people. So the aspiration is going to give us this competing stimulus that we're going to be able to focus in on, right? It's going to be sort of the at the end of the hard day, you get at the end of the hard day, we have a really big piece of fudge cake, right? So it's the fudge cake that we're going to be moving to, so we get through our really rough day. Once we have those aspirations, we want to make them really vivid. And there's a couple pieces that the vividness is going to bring for us. One is, you know, thinking about fudge cake, that's fine. But if we really talk about who am I going to eat it with, what's it going to taste like, what is it, really thick fudge or rich fudge? So it's really vivid in my mind, makes it much more sort of three-dimensional. I can sort of like step into that scene and start engaging in that aspiration right now in my, using imagery. The second part of it, I actually think there's three. I think I said there were two, but there's three. The second part of it is that it, like, thinking about our aspirations brings about a lot of positive affect really frequently. You know, when we think about, you know, going on a trip to go see my brother and, you know, hanging out with my niece and nephew and going for a hike, you know, I involuntarily smile, right? You know, I look forward to it. I can even in my mind imagine, you know, exactly where we're going to be walking along. You know, I can imagine sort of like sitting with my nephew on my lap and reading him a book right now. All that stuff I can imagine. I can even feel the weight of him because he's like a little butterball on my lap. And so it's all of this positive affect that comes along. And trust me, positive affect isn't going to hurt anybody when we're talking about really tough stuff. The next part that we can really think about is it really activates a lot of those beliefs. Remember, we're trying to like deactivate, we're trying to activate competing beliefs around others don't care about me and I'm rejected. If we're really talking with somebody about their aspiration, it's just naturally connected. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys felt as I was describing the trip to my brother's, almost like a little bit more connected to me. Right? I could imagine one or two people imagining their niece or nephew or son or daughter is like a little butterball on your lap. So there's this way that we become naturally connected. As we're talking about the aspiration and sort of, you know, dreaming about the ways that we're going to do it, we feel a little bit more competent, right? We feel connected and valued, right? So all of those, we're activating all of those competing sets of beliefs just in talking about the aspirations with the other person. And it goes from that like me versus you to sort of side by side when we're talking about these really vivid aspirations. Once we do that, once they're really enriched, we break it down to the steps that we're going to be doing right here and right now. And listen, self-injury takes a lot of time. It is a highly time-consuming endeavor. And so just by its nature, we are going to see it doesn't make sense to continue to pursue self-injury if all of a sudden it's just going to be getting in the way of the things that I want to be doing. As we start to achieve those aspirations, you know, if I'm with my younger brother, if I go off to school, if I start having Sunday dinners with my family, those are the opposite of I'm rejected, I'm alone, people don't care about me, right? And as I overcome and have urges and overcome those urges, it really gives me contradicting information around there's nothing I can do to stop the urges and things like that. So the achieving of the aspirations is a really powerful way of correcting some of those beliefs. This is the protocol, right? So we're going to activate the individual, get those aspirations, and then plan action. Thinking about it, though, that aspirations, that self-injury might come before activation. It might come before aspiration. So any way in which it blocks the motion forward. And listen, if I keep getting sent to the hospital because I'm self-injuring, right? Or I feel really ashamed, so I don't go out on a date because I just self-injured. That's just getting in the way of moving forward to the things that I want in my life. So that brings us to formulation. All of my friends on this thing, which are, I see many of there, it's sort of a no-brainer, right? So formulation, self-injury is, I'm always going to come back to, like, what's leading them to do what they're doing. Walk me through it. So let's think about self-injury and the behavior and just the generic formulation of what maintains this behavior. And I think, a lot of times what comes up is there's a lot of talk about, like manipulation and sabotage, and there's sort of all of these different pieces that come up for individuals when they're doing this. And so one of the difficulties that we can, one of the things I ask people in supervision frequently is, I get it that this person wants control, right? So especially we want to get it out of this label of sabotage or manipulation or, whatever this is, whatever weird phrase that we've come up with as providers. I go, okay, so this person wants control, right? Which all manipulation is trying to take control of the situation. We all do that. We all try to take control of the situation. And so if I'm trying to, what is leading this person to need to control the situation so badly that they actually injure themselves along the way, right? Because the self-injurers that I've worked with, it's like really serious. And so I oftentimes go, that's a lot of need to control, and we should figure out why that is. Because if we go after the need for control, ultimately, we're not getting into this argument about maladaptive or adaptive behaviors. So the first thing that we can see in this sort of in this pattern, in this model, is that the person's just sort of cooking along like normal, right? So things are just hunky-dory. And then something happens, right? People frequently call it a trigger, right? But there's something that goes on that triggers off the urge, right? And so the urge slowly grows up, and then the person self-injures, right? However they do that. And the self-injury brings relief, right? So the urge to cut will grow, and then self-injury is giving into that urge, right? And then you feel relief. I think a nice way that many of us can sort of understand is if you've ever had like a mosquito bite, or if you've ever had like sort of like an itch in your head, right? The urge to itch, or even like a sneeze, like the urge to sneeze, the urge grows and grows and grows, and then you sneeze, or you scratch the mosquito bite, right? Or you scratch your head, and we feel relief, right? So in urge, not all, but in urge is sort of that desire to do this thing. Then we feel relief, right? So the urge goes away. And anybody who's ever sneezed after it being in your nose for a minute knows the relief that comes from the urge going away. So our urges are aversive, they're uncomfortable. So when we remove the urge, we feel relief. And then once you feel relief, the cycle continues, right? Because many of the individuals that we serve feel a lot of shame and guilt or depression or hopelessness, right? Or an aversive, a negative emotion, right? So that negative emotion sets them up for another cycle, which is why a lot of times we describe that once it starts going, it becomes this cycle that continues and continues and continues, right? So the shame and guilt leads to, ultimately triggers off the urge rises, they self-injure, they feel the relief, then they feel shame and guilt as they reflect back. As they feel shame and guilt, they're at a higher likelihood of getting the urge again, right? And again, shame and guilt can also cue off other things like intrusive memories of trauma memories, right? Can be sort of negative thoughts. There's lots of things that can become the trigger. So it just becomes this cycle of trigger, urge, self-injure, relief again, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. They get stuck in this cycle that can be really difficult to break. So it really gets down to this. Many individuals have these beliefs about urges, right? And so anybody who has remembers, I think everybody on here is old enough that you probably had the chicken pox. But if anybody remembers the chicken pox, right? So like if you don't give into an urge long enough, right, the urge will actually go away, right? So urges don't last forever. But a lot of people have these beliefs about urges last forever. The only way to end the urge is to self-injure. If I have the urge, I have no choice, right? So it's the idea that the urge creates the self-injury. And in reality, we have these beliefs about the urges that the urges are going to go on forever. In reality, the urge will actually subside. If you sort of wait it out, the urge will go away. And so that's one of the things we want to help people to start recognizing is that giving into the urge is not the only way to make it go away. We can wait it out. We can distract ourselves. There's lots of things that we can do to help with urges. There's also some of these sort of permission-giving beliefs, and I think they sort of lure people in. They sort of draw us in, right? A lot of people go, well, it's just cutting. I can do it a little. This is the way that I, it's not that big of a time. It doesn't take up that much. I can be more productive once the urge is gone. There are a lot of beliefs that go along with that. And so when I tell myself it's just cutting, I sort of minimize the impact of what's going on. And I start minimizing all of the other experiences and time that it's taking up. There's also sort of cutting as communication, right? If I cut, then that's how people know that I'm upset. Cutting will let them know how bad I feel, right? So there's some of this idea around like, this is going to be the way that I communicate it to them because they won't listen any other way. And so some interventions to help along that, because think about it, if the only way you knew that people would listen to you is if you self-injured or if you screamed and yelled, what is the likelihood that you would start off by trying to make a simple request? If the only way people listen to you is if you self-injured, making a simple request doesn't really make sense. It's sort of a waste of time, right? And so instead, you're going to jump to the self-injury. But what happens is, oftentimes when people self-injure, the provider or the loved one pays more attention to the self-injury than what the individual is trying to communicate. So they get the attention for it, right? The person's listening to them, but they're actually not getting the need met of being listened to about how bad they feel. And then there's sort of like, there's sort of all these beliefs that are sort of like the mythology of cutting, the mythology of self-injury. Right, so cutting is the way that I release my feelings, right? Cutting is part of being mentally ill, right? So I'm mentally ill, so I have to cut. I've had people come into my office and say, I started, I'm having these really uncontrollable feelings, so I looked it up online and cutting is what people do. And I was like, what? There's like lots of other stuff that people can do other than cutting. So one of the questions, that came up was this idea of how do you get through to somebody when they're really distressed? And I think it's a lot like fixing spackle and a house on fire. So we're not going to fix the spackle when the house is on fire. So when the house is on fire, that's a lot about the de-escalation. And those are times of activation. Those are going to be a lot of times of validation, right? So if I'm really distressed that, my dad is not listening to me and, and I'm like, my brain is raging and on fire, it won't be the time for me to try to do a chain analysis. It's not going to be a time for me to like present a formulation. Those are going to be the times that I'm really going to validate. Like, that's really frustrating, and then try and do stuff with the individual. Might go for a walk, breathing, mindfulness, those types of things, right? I might try to meet that person with a simple gift of stress reduction. And so that might be, I think mindfulness is particularly valuable in these situations. And so engaging that individual in this way. And then as they're a little bit more reduced, as you engage them in, we're going to elicit that aspiration, because the aspiration creates this competing focus for the individual. But it's very like our aspirations can be quite exciting and like calming to us, right? You know, so if all of a sudden you had like this image to create, you know, to be like the chief science officer of a VR company to help individuals with chronic schizophrenia early while they're in the first episode. Like, as we think about this idea of like the VR and is it going to make me dizzy or am I going to get sick or whatever, you know, like all that stuff, like on one hand, it's like really exciting and engaging, but it's sort of like exciting. And so exciting is not really compatible with being like overwhelmed and distressed and upset and those types of things. So it's sort of like we're looking, you know, the aspirations really as an engagement strategy can't be overlooked. And remembering that some of the individuals with self-injury that we're talking about, they're not going to be the ones that we have to spend 800 years trying to engage, right? They're going to be very quick to engage, right? They're the ones who call you on your cell phones all night long. Like, getting them to talk to you sometimes, not all the times, isn't our main problem. Oftentimes it's getting them to, in this way of the distress being lowered. But absolutely, the activation is going to be used for reducing the distress. The aspirations are going to give us a focus together. And so even if the best we can do is get them to a spot of like not being completely overwhelmed, that's still going to be valuable, right? It's essentially like, this is going to suck, but we're moving toward that VR company. And then the final piece of it is developing a functional understanding of the cutting, which can really reduce our distress. I think we get worried that people are going to feel like we're minimizing their experience. Ultimately, what we're going to do is give them an explanation for this thing that has felt like this creature that takes over them. And so it gives them this sense of grounding in what they're going to do. We're going to start developing through chain analysis some of the intervention targets along the way, right? So what are the maintaining factors of the cutting, right? So one of the big ones is going to be beliefs about the urges. And then what are the triggers to the urges? So we're going to identify those. And then ultimately, not to be surprised, increasing activity level and engagement in productive activity. Right? If I'm engaging in moving toward this life that I want, then I'm not spending a lot of time ruminating on the things that will trigger urges. And so it's not about avoidance, it's about sort of moving toward the things that we want in our lives. So that gets us to chain analysis. And like I said, we had a whole session on it on Monday, but the idea of the chain analysis is this revisiting of the, we want to get at this sort of like revisiting of the specific situation when the person self-injured, with the idea of developing this really comprehensive chain of the series of unfortunate events that led from the trigger, or what happened before being triggered, the urge, the self-injury, and then ultimately the urge, the self-injury, and then what happened afterwards, and then how that led to circle around. And that will create really specific intervention points for us. The other way we can start finding out is going, so what's good about cutting? You know, what do you get from cutting? What's good about it? And people sometimes really be quite open about, I feel a relief. And when you hear the word relief, you want to sort of get at it and really find out if it's an urge, find out what the beliefs are about the urge. So this is actually, I'm going to show you guys a video that I put together. And this is just sort of an example, really abbreviated. I actually think it's like 1 minute and 50 seconds of what a potential chain analysis could be like. So here we go.
So if I hear you right, you were sitting and you were writing, and then you got the urge to cut. So you went into your room and then you cut. Have I got that right? So let's go back to the beginning for a second. So you're sitting and writing and you get the urge. So help me understand, where were you when you were writing? Like, was there anybody around you? Oh, so you're sitting in the living room and your family's around you, and you're writing, and then you get the urge, and then you go into your room. Have I got that right? Okay, so I just want to go back to the beginning. So you're sitting in the living room and your dad's on the couch. What's that like for you? Okay? So you're sitting in the living room, your dad's on the couch, and you're writing, and you're feeling really alone. And then you get the urge. What went through your mind? Oh. So let me see if I've got this right. You're in the living room with your dad, and you tell yourself, nobody cares about me, and you feel really alone. What's he doing? Oh, okay. So you tell yourself, I'm all alone, nobody cares about me. And then you get the urge, and then you go into your room, and that's when you cut. Have I got it all right?
It really is this this idea that a lot of times we ask people, traditionally, sometimes the chain analysis is we go, oh, what happened before? You know, what led to it? We ask it almost like the way that you ask for a person, like, what's the recipe? Tell me how to make chocolate chip cookies. Just give me the recipe. And you're like, okay, you know, a cup of flour, you know, whatever. And you just go through it. What we really wanted to do is to be like we're walking through it together. And so initially we might start with just finding out what are the pieces that are in there, right? And so we want that specific situation. And we're going to walk through it, and we're going to continue to add new layers on of, excuse me, of detail, right? So it starts with, I was writing and then I got the urge. So then I went in my room and I cut. And then we want to go, then we're going to ask, you know, we'll repeat it back. We keep sort of rewinding it and then going, okay, so you're at home, you know, where are you, right? So we start filling it in. So there's a lot of pieces that we might be missing, right? That, you know, the person says, well, I was feeling all alone, but misses the fact that she was in the room with her dad and didn't talk to her dad, right? And so we can start finding out what are the things the individual is feeling, what are they telling themselves, what do they do, and then what do they ultimately, what do they do, and then how do they react in the end? So each time through, we get a little bit more of an understanding of what it is. You know, frequently, especially early on when we're trying to organize ourselves, and chain analysis isn't something that we've done a lot of, I use this as a way of sort of moving in, partly because I think it helps to create more vividness as we revisit this memory, right? So we start with sort of the events of the situation, right? So I was in the living room. I got the urge, and I went and cut. And then we get more of the situation. So I'm in the living room. I'm sitting around. You know, I'm in there with my family. We even ultimately get more detail that it's actually just her dad and he's watching TV. We get some of the feelings, right? So as we get that in there, we can drop it and go sort of like, what was that like for you? If you notice, I'm not saying what were you feeling, what was your affect. I'm saying, what was that like for you, right? So then we kind of, that pulls at, you know, I was angry, I was alone, you know, whatever. And then this is actually pretty typical of cognitive therapy. If you think back to the original books on cognitive therapy, there's a lot of question about the feelings are more likely to be available to notice before we notice our thoughts. So that's why oftentimes if I'm going to try to draw one out, I'll draw the feelings out next. And then I move down to sort of like the reactions, which are sort of like the thoughts, what do I do, those types of things. And then other sort of like thoughts, and even what are my reactions to the thoughts as I go through it. Each time I sort of rewind the video, I add more detail into it, right? We get more information on. And that was just an example. We could have even gone further. If you notice, one of the techniques that I use in the video is I even rewind the tape before what she said. She said, I'm writing. So I rewind it to, where are you writing? What's going on? And so it's really helpful that the trigger may be happening before the individual tells us. And it's nice to remember they're not doing it to be mean. They're not doing it because they're like a bad patient. Oftentimes they're just like, if they knew why they were cutting, they'd probably not be cutting, right? Like if they could figure it out, they'd probably figure their way out of it. And so it's just helpful for us to sort of keep recognizing they're not doing this in a negative way. They're really actually doing this in a way because they probably don't know. That's why this sort of reflective quality isn't super helpful. In time, we can teach individuals this skill, but early on, this is more of a fact-finding mission. This is sort of a discovery piece for all of us to use. Each time through, if you notice, I organize it a little bit more. I have more information that I repeat back to the individual. So they're just required to sort of visualize what's going on and add the pieces in that we need. In the end, we're going to repeat back the full chain and see if we've got it right. So that gets us to the idea of aspirations. That's going to give us a really good internal source of activation when it's really vivid. And it really does create this orientation of treatment, right? We can keep cutting. We can spend a lot of time cutting, or we can get you to this thing that you want in your life. In dialectical behavior therapy, they call it that life worth living, right? But it also, and that's really used as this sort of reason against the push against what your the urges, the giving it to the urges, things like that. So a really good question came in from Carol. It came about this idea of is it connected to self-esteem? Is it this idea of seeking seeking for attention? So I think, it's ironic. Like, so self-esteem's always been a prickly thing for me because those who know me and don't despise me know that I'm not the biggest fan of vague concepts. And self-esteem, while it's really a useful concept, is extremely vague. Because if I have a bad self-esteem, that could mean I think that I'm unlovable. If I have bad self-esteem, it means that it could mean I think I'm incapable. It could mean that I think that I don't belong. It could mean that I think that I'm broken. Those are 4 different things. So it doesn't give us a lot of information, right? Self-esteem, right? And poor self-esteem just sort of means that I have like negative beliefs about myself. So absolutely, I think that a lot of the beliefs that go along that lead us to pay attention to the problems can drive from things that would be considered low self-esteem, right? So those things are like, I'm inherently unlovable. That's not very good self-esteem. I'm incompetent and completely incapable. That's not very good self-esteem. I'm helpless. That's not good self-esteem either. So those all can sort of fit in the poor self-esteem category. I think this idea of seeking attention oftentimes gets a really bad rap. I actually love the way that Carol describes it, which is that they're seeking for attention versus they're attention seeking, they're monopolizing, which all sort of like is, makes me think of like people with like a wax mustache in the back room trying to figure out, how will I get attention today? I think that one of the things, if I feel helpless and that the world's dangerous, I'm going to do work to draw people in to connect with them. And so one of the things that control that I get with self-injury will give me that attention. And like I said, while on one hand, I feel better because people are with me and are trying to help me, I'm actually not getting heard for the thing that I want to get heard for, which ultimately sets us up for, I still feel really alone. I still feel really incapable. And I've always had this sort of vibe in my mind that, like, if I lay in bed at night and I go, oh, so the only reason people come and talk to me and the only people care about me means that I have to cut. God, that's really bad, right? Like, what's going on in my life? That's the only way that people will ever come to be with me and care about me. And so I don't feel like that sets up anything any better. But aspirations actually give us things like sort of attention and connection. They sort of boost our self-esteem as we think about, cooking. And listen, a lot of aspirations that we have, they all jump off of things that we're really good at, right? So I'm looking forward, I have this aspiration to lead this like research and really good research and do that. Well, that comes off of something that I really love. Hopefully you guys get the vibe that I love talking about this stuff. So if I could research this stuff and instead of saying my buddy in Oxford just did this study, and I can go, oh man, my buddy Sonny and I just came up with this, finished this cool research. That would be fun, right? That definitely motivates me to write more, instead of saying my friend wrote this really great chapter, hopefully by the end of the year, I'll be able to go, oh, I have this chapter on distressing voices in this book, right? That's going to motivate me forward, and that's going to boost my self-esteem as well, but in these great tangible ways. So good question, Carol. So I got to be transparent at this point, right? And we're all friends now, so I think that'd be okay. I really struggle with the concept of triggers and the interventions that require and rely on avoiding triggers. I'm going to give you my reason why, and you can decide that you don't like me and that you don't like this idea. That's okay. Ooh, man, we're up on time today. Essentially, it goes like this, that when we set up interventions that revolve around avoiding triggers, I think the metaphor of a minefield is really a good metaphor, right? The problem with a minefield and marking a minefield is this. If you put signs up around a minefield, it's great, right? And you avoid the minefield and you never walk in the minefield. The problem that we get into is if you forget to read the signs, or if the signs ever just sort of blow away, right? So let's say you're like running along and you're not paying any attention and you run into the minefield. Or if you just sort of like you forget, right? The signs all blow away, then the mifield's not any more safe. And so I'm a much bigger believer of identifying the chain that leads to the self-injury and then treating the trigger. So undermining the actual trigger. So then then it's just a field, right? And so I think that's the downfall of identifying triggers and avoiding triggers. It gets into that point. So there's three main, there's three urge-based, three urge-based interventions that we're going to talk about, right? So the first one is, hold on, let me go back. Is urge surfing, right? And so the thing about urge surfing is that if you help people to recognize that urges are like a wave, right? So they're going to crest and get high, and then they're going to go down over time. And so you can help individuals learn that you can actually surf those urges down, and you can imagine them. Anybody who knows urges in the context of problems with drugs and alcohol, similar, it's exactly the same kind of urge. And so helping people recognize and really think about, get excited that, pay attention that the urge is going to continue to get more and more and more, and then recognize that it will crest, and then just sort of like wait for the urge to surf the urge down. Some people even imagine themselves on like a surfboard and coming down as they go forward. Another really neat one around urges can be that you can time the urges. So when I get an urge, you can pull out your phone and just start timing it. The timer will one, give me a little bit of space from the experience, and two, it will help the person just slowly, I have some space from it, but you also start seeing that the urge will eventually go away, and you actually have concrete times of when the urges go away. But immediately I'm not getting wrapped up in the urge because I'm timing the urge. So it gives you one step difference from it. So that's one of my favorite ones that Dr. Beck gave me. And it actually worked really well with a lot of people. It's just pull out a timer or a stopwatch. I didn't think it was really relevant to let him know that all of our phones have stopwatches now, so you don't have to like walk around with a stopwatch anymore. He's going to be like 99 soon. I figured leave that. And then there's skills for putting off cutting. So there's lots of these things that we can do, things that we can occupy our minds with right now to put off cutting. Those are things that are grounding. Those are other types of activities, things with other people, and just put off the cutting. Even if I can put off the cutting, that will sort of demonstrate for individuals that I have the ability to control it somewhat. So that brings us to guided discovery, right? And I think the piece about guided discovery is when we're working with individuals, I would encourage us to look at the helpfulness of the belief over the accuracy, right? So frequently we go, well, what's the evidence for and against that your dad didn't want to talk to you, right? And we can really move more into the idea of, does it help you to tell yourself that your dad doesn't like you? Does it make you feel better? Does it get you closer to the things that you want in your life, right? Do you make any progress? Even if it's true, is it helpful to tell yourself that? So it's shifting what we're doing. The nice thing about helpfulness is it reduces defensiveness. It's not about like, oh, you don't get me and this is bad. It's just going, oh, yeah, I can sort of see that this isn't really helpful to engage in this thinking, because I do feel worse, even if it is true that my dad doesn't want to talk to me. Once we undermine the thought by the fact that it's not helpful, accuracy can start being broached, right? We can actually start working on accuracy once we realize that it's not helpful to tell myself these things. So the beliefs that we're going to really focus in on is this idea that we're going to develop and test the idea that the urges don't last forever. We're going to test out the idea that the urges only stop through cutting, and that nothing can control the urge. Anything you do that puts off cutting is evidence that you can control the urge, right? Anytime that you sort of ride out the urge all the way, you'll see that the urge doesn't last forever. This is actually one of those times when people become curious. You can share that model that I showed in the beginning, right? That the urge goes up, that you cut, and you have relief. And then the idea that nothing you can do can impact the urge. So that's going to be timing the urge. You can even bring the urge on in session and then do something together to make it go away. And that really undermines the idea that the urges are totally uncontrollable and that nothing can be done to manage them. And then we're going to do this for action plans, right? This is a highly active treatment. So other types of, there are really great adjuncts that we can put in. So things like a DBT skills group, it's amazing. It's like the a DBT skills group is like it's like the kitchen sink of skills. For people who have had experiences of PTSD, things like prolonged exposure can be a really wonderful adjunct, because ultimately I don't have the memory popping in my mind to trigger me off from that. And then we really want to focus in on, what do you learn about yourself, others, and the future. So, but with that, thank you guys for joining me. This is always a huge opportunity for me, and I appreciate the chance to get to connect with people. And I wish you guys a wonderful weekend. Be well, take care of yourself. If I can ever be of any service, let me know. And thanks so much.
Thanks, Aaron.
Bye. You're welcome. And I'm Dr. Aaron Brinen of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Vanderbilt University. Thank you so much. See you next time.